Thank you and welcome to our presentation, Games as Story Machines. First off, is everybody in the right place? Yes. Fantastic. My name is Carl Rauscher and this is Chris Conley.
Yep, Chris Conley.
Introduction.
Yep. So I'm Chris Conley. I don't really have a title, but I guess I'm call myself interactive designer because I do a bunch of different things like web design, fiction writing, I guess mainly interactive fiction, but also a little bit of more traditional linear narrative, I guess. And yeah, the biggest project that I just released a few years ago was a choice script game called Machinations Fog of War, which was released by Hosted Games, and I'm currently working on a choice of games title with them now this year.
Hi, my name is Carl Rauscher. In case you guys couldn't tell before you got here, I'm the talkative one. I'm a fiction writer and part-time futurist. I also, in my daytime job, work for a federal agency as a game developer. But part of the reason I wanted to talk to you guys here is one of the overlaps we've been seeing a lot of in games has to do with storytelling. Everybody wants to have a game with a good, solid story behind it. It's no longer fashionable just to have one where you got a little guy runs around killing things. You want to have more meaning behind it. And when we took a look at it, there's been a lot of conversation about how to do better narrative development, how to do better discussion, but nobody's ever really talked about why. What's the idea behind it? And one of the things that I've learned over the course of developing it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the best part about a game is when you can turn to your buddy afterwards and say, here's what happened in the game I just played. And you tell them a story about what happened with your gameplay. And if you talk excitedly, and then I did this, and then the guy jumped out from overhead, and I had to swing my axe across and barely got him in time, and then all of a sudden the floor dropped out, and I felt, you're telling a story. And a really good game gives you all the tools you need to be able to tell that outstanding story, even if you're not a good storyteller. And if you can think back to the games you really loved, they've been the ones that you've been able to share in that capacity. And so we wanted to take a look and have a discussion about games as story machines. They are games that are created to help you tell a better story. So what we're going to cover is narrative design and storytelling principles. So we've got a little bit of discussion and background on knowing how to do that. And also about how games themselves have evolved to incorporate these principles. Not just video games, board games, card games, dice games, role-playing games, games of all types. You guys can read the rest. Who's it for? Is there anybody who is not on this list and feels that I'm going to be wasting your time over the next hour? Raise your hand. Tell me what would interest you a little bit more. Maybe I can slant things a little bit. Now, how many people here are writers? How many people here have a blog? Did you raise your hand when I said writer? Okay, good. If you write, if you do words, if you tell a story, chances are you are a writer, even though you may not have been published. How many people here are game developers, game designers? How many people here have made a game or taken a game and changed the rules to make it a better game? Come on. You guys got to give yourselves more credit. I mean, if you're getting paid to be a game designer, that's one thing. But we design games all the time. And the last one, those who play the games just for the stories, or primarily for the stories. How many people does that count for? Wow, I should have just asked who doesn't play a game for the stories. So we all agree, games are stories behind a game are important. Yes?
Yeah.
So let's talk about what it takes to tell a good story. Can everybody see that picture there? Well, I would have made it larger, but I wanted to stick with the same format. This is one of my crowning achievements as a geek. Let me tell you a little bit about it. Does everybody know what Gen Con is? You guys remember when it was in Wisconsin and not in Indianapolis? Yeah. It made the change in 2002, 2003. Well, in 2003, after it had left, the people around the Wisconsin area were like, this is BS. We've still got Wizards of the Coast here. So they held the first ever Game Fest. Game Fest 2003 is where this photograph was taken. Post-Gen Con moved to Indy, and this was a D&D tournament first edition. Now, at the time this came out, D&D was up to 3. I don't know if you guys remember that, but that was kind of a... Nobody likes it, but the people that like it. But the biggest difference was going back to first edition rules was very, very challenging, very, very difficult, a lot more likely to die. Not also much more likely to not be able to role play it well, because it was really designed, comes out of the core of wargaming. But we were like, you know what, this is a once in a lifetime thing. We had to give it a try. Now, who's this we I'm talking about? Well, the handsome smiling guy over there is me. And the second guy who's kind of looking away is my best friend from high school. Not only my best friend from high school, but we joined the military together. And then when he got out of the military and I was still in, we went years and years without seeing each other, but the occasional phone calls. I moved back into town. We immediately took up, and one of our things that allowed us to get back together was playing role-playing games at his house. So us going to Gen Con was a big thing. When they moved on us, it took us way out of our comfort zone as where we could transport. So this was like really our last time together to be able to do some role playing. Kind of a big thing. So we're like, you know what, let's do this tournament. Let's make it fun, see what we can do. So why would we bother getting involved? Because the final round of the tournament, if you were lucky enough to make it that far, because it was a process of elimination every round, the final round was going to be gamed by Gary Gygax himself. Anybody here not know who Gary Gygax is? Gary Gygax is the founder, creator, idea, genius behind Dungeons and Dragons. Him and a man named Dave Arnsdorf are actually the two co-founders of it, and I got to meet them both at this place, but that was besides the point. The chance to be able to match wits with him and role play was worth the risk of trying to figure out what we were doing in first edition. So, one of the things they do at a tournament like this here is they give you pre-existing characters. Pick a sheet, that's your character, go. You don't get to do hours and hours and hours of character content and development. You pick up your sheet. So I picked up a half-elf. Who doesn't play a half-elf, right? My buddy picked a dwarf. But we also realized if you wanted to get anywhere on this, you needed to impress the dungeon master. They're the ones awarding experience points, right? So it's not who can swing the best axe, who can do it in a way that's memorable, who's stylish, who's done that. So that's what we took our cue from. We were going to make sure that we were memorable. My half-elf was a badass archer who viciously, viciously, viciously hated anything having to do with magic. Conflict, automatic, built in. All I had to do was role play it, which I did, which made for a lot of arguments every time the magic user wanted to do something, or anytime we were picking up things that I wanted to destroy because they were magical. The dwarf, his most memorable thing was he frequently used to take off all of his armor and his clothes. It made for awkward times, especially in combat, but he had a tendency to feel unencumbered and therefore was more willing to take risks. We were very memorable. How memorable were we? We won our tournament round by 15 experience points. That was enough to put us into the final round, and yes, we got to match wits with Gary Gygax himself. Capstone moment of our final adventure was when the dwarf tied a rope around his waist, stripped down bare, and we tossed him up onto the roof because we did not have a grappling hook that would stick on the slates. And then he held himself in place on the roof, and we climbed up. And I distinctly remember the look on Gary's face as we explained that we were going to toss the dwarf. He shook his head, rolled the dice, did not tell us what the number was, did not tell us what the thing was. And then he looked at the dice and kind of sunk and had to say that we had succeeded. Very memorable time. Well, we also won like tickets to the next year and got autographs and all that kind of stuff, but that's besides the point. It was the look on his face in that capstone moment. You notice what I did there when I was telling the story. I talked about the situation. I talked about the characters that were involved in it. I gave you guys what their goal was, what some of the stakes were if they failed to reach that goal, some of the major decision points that went into it, and more importantly, what was the outcome of all this? What was the reason behind doing it all this? And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about it. What kind of game allows you to do those things? Anybody have any idea who John Titor is or 2001? Bonus points. Okay. Absolutely. He was back in the days before the internet was just barely getting off the ground, and he was on some backwaters forum claiming to be a time traveler who came back from the future, back to the 1960s, to get a particular piece of equipment that would allow him to convert an obscure programming language that was desperately needed into the future that was having a problem. And along the way, he stopped in 2001 to check on his like 5-year-old self or something. Amazing stories. And when people would question him on it, he always had an answer, always had an explanation about why things were the way they were, how the time travel supposedly worked, although he wasn't one of the top theorists kind of thing. He was just the lowly operator. And that machine there is what he presented out of the quote-unquote operator's manual for the government time machine that he was using. That's besides the point. The point of this is a game machine is one that is going to provide mechanics that allow players to create their own stories. And what we are going to do is we're going to discuss about the very different types of games as they have evolved. And we're going to discuss these 4 main points, and we encourage you guys to call us out and give us your feedback on the different things. First thing is, does it follow that narrative structure I talked about when I did the storytelling? Does it provide those elements to allow you to do that? Does it have player-created content? Because if you're not part of it, you're just reading somebody else's stuff, I might as well just be giving you a book, right? Randomness is an inspiration. If everything is preordained, again, is it really your story? It needs to have that element that kind of spurs you, gives you that idea, gives you that spark. Otherwise, we're just sitting in a room saying, okay, and then what happened? And the last part is, it has to be a shareable outcome. You need to be able to tell somebody else what happened with the story. If it takes you 45 minutes to explain what's going on in order to talk about that terribly neat thing, it's probably not as shareable as you were hoping. And I guarantee the people that you've been trying to talk to for 45 minutes don't think it's shareable either. So, we clear about what we're going to do? Does anybody have any questions, any feedback? We've been kind of throwing things out pretty hard and fast, right? Not really. I would love to. However, we've been trying to fight with it the entire time. Okay. I was going to say, if you guys really want a copy of this, let me know after the speech. I'll give you a copy of it, okay? So we're going to start with early role-playing games.
Yeah, so I guess the first one up there is D&D, which basically created the genre of role-playing games. Like, it was originally derived from, I think, Gygax's Chainmail, which is a wargaming miniatures game. And he had some players who were interested in, like, kind of telling stories about what their little wizards and elves were doing. And so he decided to write up some rules for adding the story play to the miniature war games. And obviously that became a big industry and pretty much turned into a whole other thing than what he had been expecting. And
Oh, the other three down here at the bottom, are you guys familiar with these three? Traveler, GURPS, and Amber. For those who aren't, let me tell you why I put them up there, because everybody knows D&D. Matter of fact, if you're discussing role-playing games, you're even subconsciously comparing it to Dungeons and Dragons. It established so many of the conventions. Traveler, down at the bottom, science fiction, space-based, role-playing game. And the main reason I put it in there and why it is still has that quirky little nature, it is the only game that I am personally familiar with where you can die during character generation. That was so amazing when they did it at the time. Over the process of developing your character, you actually got to know them. So when you hit that point and you rolled bad and all of a sudden they died, you're like, no. And that was just starting. You didn't even get to actually start playing the game. The creating a character was its own mini game as part of it. GURPS, generic universal role-playing, was one of the first ones to establish different genres, different types of role-playing. If you wanted to play medieval Japan, they had a source book so you could do that. If you wanted to play in Larry Niven's Ring World, they had a source game for doing that. If you wanted to play Ice Age, you wanted to be running around barbarians riding on a mammoth, they made one for that. It was basically allowed people modularize and take bits off of this one and bits off of that one and create their own genres. And they put out so many books and so many types. Every one of them gave you new ideas on how you could take the stories that you were telling with your buddy, and they were all interchangeable. Last one, Amber, otherwise known as Amber Diceless Role-Playing Game. It was based off a series of books written by Roger Zalansky called The Chronicles of Amber. In effect, you were part of a family that had the ability to walk between dimensions. And when you can walk between dimensions, you can go to any dimension that you can imagine, which means there is nothing you can't find if you're looking for it. With that kind of a backdrop, what else is there? Family intrigue is really about it. The only people that can really stop you are people from your own family. What it did differently is it got rid of the dice. Anytime you wanted to do something, if nobody was stopping you from doing it, you could do it. If somebody was stopping you, which one was stronger? So what they did during their generation is they did a bidding mechanism. You had so many points that you started up to create your character, and you would bid, how much for strength? And you'd go through, and basically you would settle it that way, and everybody had ranking. So that anytime you wanted to do something that involved strength and you were opposed by somebody else, you just compared the two ranks. If yours was higher, you won.
And it was a secret ballot, so there was a kind of system of, I guess, like playing the other person, like gamified.
Yeah, absolutely. It had almost like a poker kind of deviousness to it when you were trying to evaluate how much is just enough to get past what I think the other person's going to do, and which one do I think he's going to want to sink more of his points into it, because maybe I can cause him to spend more points than he needs to. Whole little mini game within it as well. The other thing that it did was, if you knew you were going to get your butt kicked in a strength contest and going up against this other guy, guess what? You role-played it so it wasn't about strength. Maybe it was about will. Maybe about magical ability. Something you were stronger than him in. And of course, he's going to try to role-play it back into so where strength is necessarily important. So it really becomes a strong interchange in the character relationship part. So much more than role-playing game where you're just rolling dice and going against a target number that's being set by an arbitrary person. All of them were groundbreaking in role-playing games. So let's talk about narrative structure. We all can tell how Dungeons and Dragons fits the narrative structure. Role-playing games themselves, they're really set up to follow all these. You are the player characters. You are given situations. You establish your goals, or maybe they're established for you. And typically the stakes are set as you're going through and you're uncovering what's going on. You're having several decision points, usually done by encounters. And obviously it's shareable because you're doing this sitting around a table with all your friends. And if you did it right, you could talk to other people who weren't at the gaming table and convince them that they just missed out on the most awesome game.
Yeah, I guess as far as player-created content, some of them have more than others. Like, usually in all of them, you create your own character. Although in something like Traveler, you might have less influence on that, and it's more randomized. But in some games, I guess like GURPS, you have all of the different settings that you can choose to set the game in. But something like D&D or Amber, the setting is more predefined for you by the story game system creators.
I would definitely agree with that. One of my biggest things I used to dislike about Dungeons and Dragons was the tables that you had to go through of equipment. And every time you got more money in your pocket and you hit a thing, you're just flipping page after page looking for things that are on this list because the DM was too lazy to go, you know what, it's going to be worth about this much. It's going to have this much available. Rather than having to make those kind of determinations and allow you to customize your own thing, the DM could really limit that if they were not comfortable with what they were doing. Whereas you get to the later ones in Amber, oh yeah, you were bringing on the content. You were creating entire worlds that you were able to walk, and the creatures that were on there and the situations that we're in. So it did start to span back and forth. Randomness as an inspiration, very much so in the initial Dungeons and Dragons as we learned playing the first edition, where the 3 dice you rolled at the beginning, the 3d6, that was it. There was no rolling 10 and bidding and all this kind of stuff, whatever, to get your mini max in for the thing. If you rolled a 3, you had to play a character with a 3, which meant a lot of times you ended up with an unplayable character. Unless you're the kind of person who loves to play an unplayable character and you make a half-orc barbarian with a 3 intelligence and you play him that way. Thus was born Zacharias the Mad. But randomness, like I said, it's harder in a diceless role-playing game to do the random part because you're counting on each other. So the randomness becomes, I don't know what you're going to do, which is not the same as counting on randomness of dice or cards.
Yeah.
And then the last part, shareable outcomes. We all agree it's immensely shareable. Shall we move on? Let's talk about some more recent role-playing games. Powered by the Apocalypse. Anybody not heard about that? Oh. It started with Apocalypse World, which is actually based off of a modification of a smaller indie narrative game, other kind, I believe it was. Basically, all the challenges in that you were dealing with, they involved establishing moves, which is kind of like preset things that you could do. If you're thinking video game, you know what your list of things that you can do, the different actions, buttons that you can push to make different things. Moves kind of gave you that same thing, but they were much more malleable. And then you always had the same target number, and you were always rolling 2d6. But here's the key. If you rolled a 6 or less, you failed. But it didn't mean that you died necessarily. It just meant that whoever the game master was could make something very interesting and unhappy happen for you. 7 to 10, a little give and take. Maybe you'd get what you want, but there'd be some counter. You'd have to basically sacrifice something. And if it was 10 or more, you succeeded. But it always sometimes, you succeeded in what you wanted, but maybe it really wasn't what you wanted because you're always getting some twist to it. Just taking that simple core mechanic of doing the moves and how they did particular aspects of it. And they also developed a couple other things like fronts, where basically, if you're more familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, how you used to do an encounter, a front is basically having different encounters where the factions within them had combined purposes and goals, and they had different clocks to advance on their agendas. It gets all complicated. But one of the benefits of it is that core mechanic and that core thing has been so malleable that people have used it to create a wide variety of different types of games now, such that the phrase powered by the apocalypse means that your game uses a lot of those same core mechanics, but you've added your own particular style, your own particular playability, and you're encouraging people to explore and advance in that world. Fate, are you guys familiar with Fate at all? It's another role-playing game system that they developed that uses dice in a different way, does the mechanics in a different way, and they also strongly encouraged people to come up with play worlds, sort of the way that GURPS did, but they would also allow you to get more heavily involved into how the core mechanics work, involving special moves, different abilities. And then lastly, we added Minecraft, or I added Minecraft. So shall we go through the list? Do they provide narrative structure? Yes, no, yes? All of them? Some of them?
I'd say probably not Minecraft so much.
I was going to say, Minecraft is probably the weakest link on that one. It really doesn't have any sort of narrative structure. The one benefit that I did, and the reason that I did include it, was because it included the shareable outcome when they created realms. It took it from being a single player game that you at home building that castle in the sky, and it allowed you and your buddies to collaborate together to create things and involve challenges. And as the randomness of what was going on and it happened, you're basically creating the story that you're telling with yourselves. But it doesn't give you the structure, the narrative structure. Second part, player created content. Do you guys think they all meet that?
Yeah.
Pretty solidly, like I said. And as far as the recent role-playing games, they actually encourage you to get in there as to how the rules themselves are defined and how you are going to do that, because it's more important for you and your buddies who are playing these role-playing games to have that shared collaborative experience. You shouldn't be hampered by a rule that just doesn't fit well with what you guys are doing.
Also defining the setting itself.
Absolutely. Randomness as an inspiration. I think all three of them definitely fall into that realm. You're still involving dice. You're still involving matching wits against somebody else, so there's that unknown factor. The fact that Fate Worlds, you could be playing a game and understand all the mechanics of it, yet get thrown into a completely different one. I was taking a look to see what the different Fate World one. There's one of them where you're playing in a detective in the Roman Empire. Another one, you're playing cats who are against supernatural evil. There's another one where you are paranormal investigators. And I think there's something involving spaceships and ghost worlds. Like I said, it takes your imagination so far beyond Dungeons and Dragons. Shareable outcomes. I think absolutely these fall into the shareable outcomes thing, especially with the addition of the realms in Minecraft. And not only that, I was kind of surprised to find out through my research, how many people here play Fortnite? Exactly. You know what's more popular and what people are playing more of their time on? Minecraft. They came back to it. Why? I think because it offers a better narrative experience when you are able to share the content. Again, I could be wrong, and you guys could probably think of other things that we're not seeing here. And in which case, if we have time at the end, I'd love for you guys to bring those forward so we can also discuss them. Let's move on to narrative games. Okay, I'll take this one. Fiasco. Anybody here played it? If you haven't had a chance, if you have not had a chance, you'll love it. Anybody know what a Coen's brother movie is? What's some of the defining features of it? Everybody's got an agenda. And those agendas are not aligned. And every step you take trying to get towards your agenda is getting screwed by somebody else who's taking a step towards getting to their agenda. It has the mechanisms and the core structure behind it, regardless of what setting you pick and regarding what pieces you guys are playing and regarding your guys' individual things, is guaranteed to give you an ending that's going to look like a Coen Brothers movie. It uses relationship webs to define your characters. because your character is basically what's the relationship to the person next to them. And it gets defined randomly. It's also one of the few games where you don't want to succeed all the time. Succeeding all the time is going to give you just as much of a horrible outcome as failing every single time. I also included up in the middle, I don't know if you guys can tell, that's Lady Blackbird. It's another narrative storytelling game where they give you the play set element pieces, but they don't tell you what they mean. As you're playing, you are defining what it is in context. And then the third one, The Quiet Year. Anybody heard of that one? A little more obscure, but I find it absolutely fascinating as a fiction writer. You're using a deck of cards and flipping over the cards, and the cards compared to like an oracle chart tell you what's happened in the life of this post-apocalyptic small community that's trying to survive before winter arrives. So each card that you're playing gives you one of two questions that you get to answer. And you're also developing a map as you go. It is so heavily involved in spurring your creativity. The middle two, De Profundis. Anybody heard of that one? You guys are missing out. It's an epistolary role-playing game. You are writing letters with the other people that you're playing the game in. And originally it was written to have a Call of Cthulhu type feel. So it's about you slowly discovering these sanity-breaking eldritch horrors that are happening around you. And you're doing it all through letters that you're sending to people. So the letters would be like, you know, I just got over that cold last Sunday, and I decided I was going to go, you know, see the fair that was happening, you know, downtown, and this and that, you know, and then you start adding little tiny elements in there, like, you know, I dreamt of the tentacles again last night. For the third day in a row, there's a dead crow at my doorstep. You know, and explain what these things are, and other people. So what somebody gives you, you then take that and you add to it, like I said, and you're building that shared thing. The other one is The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Anybody's heard of that one? You guys know who Baron Munchausen was? He was known as a very flamboyant liar. And so this game is you and a bunch of people who are sitting around trying to act or tell a story in that style where you become more and more outrageous, and anybody can interrupt you at any time and say, I find that hard to believe. It is improvisation on a high speed, high note, but it's guaranteed to be fun. The bottom three, Primetime Adventures, Microscope, and Archipelago. Primetime Adventures is about running a TV studio. And you and the other characters are basically writing the next episode. You know, your 5-act TV series that you're doing kind of thing. And you're actually doing it for the entire season, and you're worried about, you know, making sure that you got enough popularity in your ratings so that you don't get canceled. But as far as what the TV show is and what the style, you know, that you're doing, that's up for you guys to decide what kind of show it's going to be and who gets to be the main character of that particular event as it goes, because it's always an ensemble cast that you're doing. So if you wanted to play a Firefly TV series, knock yourself out. If you wanted to do a police procedural, knock yourself out. If you wanted to do a Monster of the Week supernatural-y type thing, knock yourself out. Microscope and Archipelago are also ones where they're designed for, as you're playing it, you're defining more and more about what the background is, the timeline, the history behind what's going on with the particular events, and you can dive in and out. That's why it's called Microscope, because you can get down, focus on one particular area of history, dive yourself back out, and like, oh, what's happening over here? And in the course of what's going on, you're defining the entire story arc that you're doing. So if you guys have not played narrative games, you guys are missing out on a lot. If you have been playing narrative games, there's so much more out there that we did not touch on this one here. We just wanted to give you samples of the different styles of play. Absolutely.
All right. I guess so. Has anyone here heard of Ron Edwards? No? Okay, this is a guy who was a role player who I think he primarily played with a group of friends in his system, I think was Hero Quest. But he found that basically he and his friends were kind of breaking the system, like they're throwing out a bunch of rules. and trying to, like, usually without even realizing it, like not playing the game as written just because they weren't interested in the kinds of stories and the gameplay that they were interested in. They were interested in really punchy, dramatic stories with, I guess, like action and consequences and just a lot of drama. And the systems that were out there basically in the 80s were mainly about going around and collecting loot and fighting monsters and things that weren't really interested in them. So around the end of the 90s, he decided that he wanted to encourage these sorts of games that didn't exist back then, that were mainly narrative focused. So he created this discussion forum online in the early 2000s called The Forge, which was basically, he started out before he even created that, making these essays on game design in RPGs. And there wasn't very much of that out there back then either. And from this, he used it as a base to launch this discussion forum where people would come in and talk about the games that they played and how they felt about it, and I guess what they were trying to do with their RPG designs. And so he was basically encouraging people to write the games that they wanted to play, and encouraging this independent development and self-publishing of RPGs, which led to a whole bunch of games along these lines.
I actually found The Forge when I was looking for that role-playing experience in order to be able to write better science fiction and fantasy. You know, how could I actually do it where I'm surprising myself in the process of writing it, but give myself a little bit more structure? And the narrative games that I've encountered, for example, the ones here, were perfect for me for that particular thing. And I wanted to understand how these came into being. So The Forge was really good at being able to dive back and follow those discussions as people were discovering how they wanted to create narrative games. What were they using for criteria? Didn't agree with everything they were saying, and some of them were heated debate. But a lot of times people would be like, I had an idea, and I wanted to run with it, and so I made this little game, tell me what you think. And it blew up into these.
Yeah, and I guess one of the big mantras of Edwards and The Forge was that system does matter, and that even though technically you can like take D&D and remove like half the rules and turn it into some diceless system or something that really encourages dramatic systems, it's a lot easier and to just start with a system that's designed for that from the outset.
Well, as we've discussed, narrative structure. These are built with narratives in mind. So they really design the rule sets to help you develop those particular narratives. Player-created content, they give you the tools for it. Like I said, in Fiasco, they develop play sets. So if you wanted to play in a small Midwestern town, they give you just enough key elements that you can define this is what a small Midwestern town would feel like, especially if you've never been there before. But then you turn it into like meth making and drug smuggling and cops involved in it. I'll let you guys play that one. Randomness is inspiration. Randomness is still necessary for a lot of these here, but they don't let you get in the way of the narratives themselves. A lot of them are used strictly for the inspiration part.
Yeah, and I guess usually in these sorts of designs, it's set up so that either way the dice fall, like succeed or fail, will result in an interesting narrative outcome. Like generally you don't want a die roll to determine whether the story just comes to a halt or whether you can keep going. So if there's something that needs to happen for the plot to progress, then it just happens. There's no need to roll the dice.
And lastly, shareable outcomes. Again, a lot of these were designed to be played as a group. I mean, you can try them solo, but it doesn't turn out to be near as much fun because you don't have that shareable aspect of it. So I'd say if you're not playing them with a group, it's hard to come back afterwards, and in which case you're just telling the story that you created alone with the game. But any one of these, like I said, I would gladly sit down with a group of people who have never played it before, teach them just enough of the rules and get into it. In Fiasco, I have taken groups at like Balticon and other conventions and sat down and had somebody who's been a diehard gamer for years and years and years and his girlfriend who's never played. And both of them had an excellent time playing Fiasco, and both of them contributing heavily to it. So it definitely has the structure, but it doesn't get away of the fun. Some of the other ones, a lot more involved in the mechanics, trying to figure it out, especially if you were raised on the traditional RPGs, but definitely worth the time. Now, we've focused a lot on writing, but I also wanted to discuss briefly story-making games. You guys familiar with these? Any of these? Starting with originally with Once Upon a Time, which was a card deck with images on it. And basically, you played the game. You'd start off with an ending. Each person would draw an ending card. And then a handful of these elements that would come in, you'd traditionally find in a fairy tale. And you would try to tell a story based on the cards in your hand. And if you played, you're like, and then I was trying to get across the river and, on a tree blocked my way. Well, somebody else had a tree card. They could play it and take over the narrative. And now they could start telling the story their way, leading towards their ending. And the idea was to try to get rid of all your cards and reach your ending. Interesting mechanic, but unless you were steeped in fairy tales, or that was your particular thing, it was a lot harder to get, do a sci-fi adventure hack and slash. Rory's Story Cubes. You can buy these in Target. Each cube has an image on it, on each one of the faces, and you roll them, and then you basically make a story out of the images you see. They have supplemental packs that'll take you everything from dinosaurs to super spies to Batman. Again, very heavily, it's much of this, but not necessarily how to tell a good story. Until they come up with that center image there, which is Untold Adventures Await. It's the board game that they created, which is driven by Rory Story Cubes. And actually, each one of the positions on there is part of the narrative structure, the setup, the incident, complications, climax going through. So it helps add some of the structure to it, but again, it's still basically being inspired by what you have. And then down at the bottom, you guys familiar with the legacy games? Anybody played them? Like them, hate them? It's okay to hate them. I personally don't understand why, but for those who are not familiar with legacy games, Pandemic is a board game where you're trying to stop 4 epidemics from happening simultaneously on a world map. And every play, more and more people are breaking out in infections and they're getting particularly worse, and you're trying to run around the world trying to solve them. What they did was they added a series of things where every time you played the game and major things would happen in it, like if it took over an entire city, like Hong Kong, got hit with a massive thing and you basically killed off everybody in the city. The next time you play the game, Hong Kong is not available. The rules actually tell you, rip up the Hong Kong card because you're not using it ever again. And then after the 3rd time you're playing the game, maybe you meet a new requirement and it says, pull this sticker out of this box and put it into this particular spot. You now have a new rule that applies every time you play this game. One of my favorite things about it is every time you solve one of those epidemics that's going on, you get to name it. And there's actually a spot on the board for you to write what the name of that epidemic was. The second one on there is Betrayal Legacy. It's originally designed from Betrayal and House of the Hill. Now imagine you're going to play 13 episodes of this game. And every time your character dies, you become a ghost that then appears in all subsequent games. It basically, at the end of all these here, is designed after 15, 20 games of play. That board has been so permanently marked and so permanently adjusted, you can continue to play that game forever and ever, and it'll still bear the hallmarks of what happened during those 15 or so games that you have played. It also convinces you to play these games 15, 20 times so that you can follow through. But it was a genius idea because how many times have we played Monopoly? Nobody plays it anymore. Why? There's no stories. The only stories you have is about how somebody got pissed off and flipped the board. That's not fun. It originally came from the idea where somebody said, I don't know why they keep inviting Colonel Mustard to Clue, because every time he shows up, somebody dies. And so they got in the idea of what happens if a game remembered every time you played it. That became the basis of Legacy. So every one of these that you see up here was designed with the idea in mind of creating a story, of making a story. Narrative structure. I would say that story cubes, or Once Upon a Time, are very horrible for narrative structure. They require you to do all the heavy lifting on it, and if you're not a good storyteller, you're not going to have a happy experience playing those. As you get towards the later ones, you become more involved in the storytelling process and not the story making process. The rules help you do that part. Player created content, up in the first part, you're providing the inspiration behind it, you're providing the narrative. So yeah, it kind of does have the player content. Down at the bottom, getting to name a bubonic plague that took out most of Africa. Yeah, I'm all about that. But I don't know how much more player created, because it's still, you're letting somebody else tell the story of what's happening by how they divide the rules. Randomness is inspiration.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, no. I think it does for a lot of them. But again, it gives you that different experience. And then lastly, shareable outcomes. The only way the legacy ones are shareable is in the fact that if it's you and your buddies, they're going to keep playing that game. And they're going to understand what they mean by Harvey the ghost in the library. Somebody's going to have to retell those stories, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, as long as you're keeping it in that same community and that same family. If you were to go to Goodwill and find out that somebody, donated their game and now you're playing it, it doesn't mean anything to you because the stories aren't there. So, yes, it helps. No, it doesn't. Everybody agree? You don't have to agree with everything, guys. You can violently disagree as long as you don't toss stuff. Interactive/online storytelling. See, now we're starting to get into the digital age. You knew we were going to get there, right? Very up at the top. Anybody know what that is? It's a mud. Anybody heard of that term? Come on, we're showing our age here. If everybody knows what a mud is. You know what a mud is?
yeah, like it stands for multi-user dungeon. It's kind of like a text-based interactive fiction, but multiple people play online at once.
Way back in the days when you used to have to use dial-up in order to get onto the internet, this was how you socialized. This was our second life. You would log on, you would create a character, you'd go into this particular world, you'd traipse around. If there was somebody else who was also logged in at the same time and they happened to be in the same particular area, you could actually converse with that character. You could exchange weapons, information. You could go on a mutual hunt to go after that dragon, or whatever the particular setting was of the particular mud. That's why it was multi-user. And they originally were calling it dungeon, but then some of them started to get away from the Dungeons and Dragons feel and started to do more space or more Western, whatever kind of thing, and it turned into multi-user dimension. But the main part is multi-user. It was really a chance to share and contribute and do that collaborative storytelling. And then you've got The Sims, which is basically somebody added a graphical interface, but it allowed you to do more sandbox style, but you could still create things. Never really got into that. And then Second Life, which is well ahead of its time, I think. It gave people so much power to create. And it allowed it to people who really shouldn't have been given that power to create. I remember so many times where I'd be like, I'm ready, I think I'm going to go into Second Life, and then I'd hear a report about griefers, where somebody'd be trying to do something legitimate, and all of a sudden they're getting swarmed of animated phallic symbols parading through their area and tearing down stuff and leaving graffiti up, and I'm like, I don't want that in real life. I'm sure not going to go online and get it. I'm not sure that Second Life was helping. And down at the bottom, I wanted to find several other examples of something that's more recent that has that collaborative, shared storytelling space. And the only thing I could really find was a product called Storium. Has anyone here heard of Storium? They have some of the worst press in the world, apparently, and I don't know why. This is a genius product. It provides the collaborative storytelling of Dungeons and Dragons in any type of world, any type of setting. You and your friends repeat, continuing to add and share on this narrative, but it allows you to do it asynchronously. You basically agree that you are going to tell this tale together. Each one of you creates a character with certain traits, and each of those traits is represented by a card. And then maybe you have certain objects, things in your backpack. Those are represented by a card. Maybe you have certain skills that you pick up along the way. Those are represented by a card. And what happens is every episode has a series of challenges. So it's on a Monday, we're all starting it, whoever's running, hosting it, puts together, here's the new challenge, which is represented by a card. But he also gives you narrative and explains, when you guys left the beach and you moved inland and you discovered that strange artifact, this is what happened. And now that card becomes in context. And that card maybe requires 4 something to defeat. Well, I need to look at my character and figure out what cards I can think of to narratively explain how I would use it. So if my card is strong-willed, I fight back the fear that's rising within me kind of thing, and I, run forward and I hit it with a rock. And then somebody else takes their turn, and they do it. The thing is that can all be happening during the week. Nobody has to be there online doing it all at once. Nobody is telling you what your character can or can't do. You establish some basic rules up front, like I can't kill off anybody else's character, or I can't use your character without permission. So maybe if I want to have something where we're going to have an interlude and me and his character are going to plot together to, take this whole thing in a new direction, I contact him offline in an offline chat and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? Can we pool resources, at least until we get through the next thing? So it has a lot of those same elements, but it's all done online. And they give you all the tools, and they step you all through it, and they give you the creativity. They went through a second round of funding on Kickstarter, and they included, I want to say 45 noted authors who each created a world tool set, which basically is a bunch of cards that fit into the different criteria so that you can make up games and stories in these people's worlds. And you don't have to think, how do I create a card for it? They're all here. They're all to play. If you get tired and bored and the 2 people you were playing with don't want to play anymore, you put up and say, hey, I'm looking for a new game. Who's got a game out there? You can play anybody's game as long as you get permission. And they'll do interviews, or they'll say, this and that. If you get tired, you don't want to play anymore, you contact the host and say, I can't do this anymore, I'd love to. He takes over your character, puts it out to somebody else and says, hey, doing it. Meanwhile, all that narrative that you've been building up, all these different episodes, they're all online. You can go back and read through them. I said, genius idea, poor marketing, the fact that nobody else has heard of it. And they just recently come out with an EDU version, which is designed for use in the classroom. They simplified the rules and discussion for it to make it easier for teachers to be able to use in the class. So rather than assigning them boring 4-page essay, they're now encouraging kids to make up stories together and giving them challenges that are more fitting with what it is they're trying to discuss.
It's kind of running out of time.
Yep. So we're going to try to move quickly on it. Narrative structure on the upper part, very, very hard to have a narrative structure in there. You're basically playing somebody else's world. The parts that you are creating are not narratively done, but when you collaborate with somebody, you will come up with a good story that you can put together. The bottom part is very heavily under the narrative construction, but offers a lot more. Player-created content, I think they both agree, and they allow you heavily amounts of that as much as you want to. MUDs, you used to have to know how to program in it, but they made it embarrassingly easy, and a lot of people would help you for free. Randomness is inspiration. Yes, no? I think a lot of the randomness is coming from you don't know what somebody else is going to do or how they're going to play. And then shareable outcomes, absolutely. This is where you're going to shine.
Yeah. So I guess this is something that is only really possible, I think, in, I guess, like the interactive electronic, like video game field, just because it involves tons of variables and sometimes different AI agents. But I guess, yeah, like a lot of these systems are somewhat similar. Veritale and Versu and Storytron especially, they involve, from the author's side, creating a bunch of AI characters that have like personalities and goals, and setting up a set of different actions that each of them can take, and with the rules, the consequences for what happened when they take these actions. And the idea, I guess, in something like Versu and Veritale, those are both that Emily Short was involved in, who's written a lot of game design. She has a great blog about this. But yeah, like in those, and Storytron was another one that's basically creating these procedural systems of the kind of telling stories, and the player comes in and plays one particular character and takes certain actions, and then the system decides what's going to happen and what characters are going to do in response iteratively over time. It's kind of like the style of a MUD, but in single player. And Fallen London, something that's based on the Story Nexus game system, and there's also Sunless Seas and Sunless Skies by the same company. That is a system that's called, I guess what Emily Short calls quality-based narratives, but the idea is that the story is like divided up into all of these tons of different small subplots and scenes, and the game system picks out different scenes, and usually it's picking something that is something that's the player has indicated that they're interested in. Like if they're into swashbuckling or magic or something, then it'll pick more magic-based scenes, and the player picks up certain actions within that scene using different resources.
I guess the best way to think about it is, it basically, the creativity part that it allows you to do is you get to set what the goals are for what your character is. And the things that are going to happen to you are based on those decisions that you made, and as you're going through and doing different encounters. A lot of the structure that, from what I've seen from these, think of it like the way Dungeons and Dragons did encounters. But picture thousands of them that can be randomly generated based on particular skills and particular attributes. And so it's going to take a look behind the scenes without asking you to keep track of things on a lengthy sheet of paper to say, what attributes do you have? So I can make sure that the next thing that happens for you is going to be of interest to you and is going to help you get towards your goal. And if you don't seem to have a particular goal in mind, maybe I'll put a couple leads in front of you and see which one you want to follow. It allows a lot more proceduralness, but part of the challenge of proceduralness is, how do you get those pieces to fit together? And that's where I think a lot of the player connectivity goes, especially in Fallen London. There's all these different stories and all these different multitude of pieces to go together, and you are the one that helps put them in context. So it's no longer just a matter of this happened and then this happened and then this happened. You can say, this happened to me, and then I did this, which caused that to happen. And it's that cause and effect that helps you build.
Yeah, I guess the approach for designing for one of these systems is basically you're creating this giant possibility space for players to explore and decide how they want to act within it.
So as far as narrative structure goes, we are definitely dealing with situations and characters. You are helping establishing what the goals are. Sometimes you may not understand what the stakes are necessarily with it, but you are also making decisions with it, and then the computer itself is generating not only the consequences, but what are going to be the next situations you may encounter. It's trying to automate a lot of the Dungeon Master parts so you can actually start taking pet and starting to be more of a character in the story that you're trying to tell, rather than having to do all the mechanic stuff. And I think that's one of the things that computers really bring to the forefront with it. I think there's things that are going on in the future that are really going to make that spark. The challenge is, how would you get involved with it if you wanted to write in this world? There's a bit of a learning curve.
Yeah, very. So we're out of time. Do you know how much later we can go.
Until they kick us out or until everybody leaves.
Okay.
We only got one more really don't want to run into. You guys heard of this? Well, for those of you who haven't, it all started off with the very first top one there. Red versus blue. People would play the game, record the video of them playing the game, and then cut and splice those video scenes together to tell a new story. And then they moved on to doing it in The Sims, where you could actually position cameras and do things and set situations up so that you can get just that right shot. And in Neverwinter Nights, they actually gave you the tool sets. You can actually construct scenes and settings and that there, and then try to like shoehorn things in so you can get that right shot. Didn't always work well. It was really clunky because it was much older. And my absolute favorite, was it Lionsgate? Lionhead.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lionhead Studio. The same people that brought you Fable, they created called The Movies, where you were a movie tycoon. You were going to run your own movie studio. So you could play the game and do the resource management and build up your studio, but it also allowed you to create and actually get down into the weeds and create the scripts. So you had this pool of actors and actresses that were currently working for your studio, and then you could write a script, and you could actually put them in the scene, and there was like this huge menu of scenes that you could have them play out, that you could put the cameras on, and again, put them all together, recut them, recast them, make it into a movie. I've seen where people were doing this to make political commentary on situations that were going on in Bosnia-Herzegovina at the time to give people a sense of this is what's really going on in our lives. Was not what the game was designed for, but by God, they were going to use it, and I applaud them for it. The only problem is I wish more things like this were available so that people who can't afford to have full-blown movie sets can actually take advantage of some of the more resources that are coming on without having to learn how to be in-depth coders for it. They come out with a sequel for it called Stunts and something else, Stunts and Effects, I think it was, that allowed you to do like car crashes and explosions and jumping out of an airplane and stuff like that. It never really caught on. It was well ahead of its time. The graphics are really crap now. But narrative structure provided none of that. You had to bring all that yourself. Player created content. You could create the situations. You could create what types of characters you wanted to put in the situation, same as you were directing a movie. But unless you were a graphic designer, you were probably not going to get very far. Randomness is inspiration. That was actually trying to take randomness out of the situation. If you're trying to direct it, I don't want this character wandering off in his own direction. I want him going where I told him to. And in shareable outcomes, that was part I think they did well. There was an entire YouTube channel for this that was set up until all of a sudden the owners decided, nope, we don't want anybody to do anything with it anymore. We're not making money off of it. And they shut it down, and people lost thousands of hours of content, which is kind of where the death knell of it. But I thought it was a worthwhile aspect of it because we are talking about story-making machines.
Yeah, I guess like the idea of the movies was basically systematizing, creating machinima as gameplay.
So what comes next? This is the only thing that really came to my mind other than showing a picture of data on the holodeck. Because we're not quite there yet. Lord, I wish we were. AI Dungeon, and
This is
more
really
importantly,
close.
AI Dungeon 2 is where they have finally put technology where they can do. They open AI that goes through a huge pool of stuff. And every time you ask it for something, it reaches into that pool and comes out with something that maybe makes sense, maybe doesn't make sense, but allows you to feed off of it, kind of thing. So imagine an open-ended role-playing game that basically took cues from whatever you were saying in like an improv and just ran with it. So the little part up here, whistle for one of the dragons to come back. And it provides you a little paragraph of narrative based off of that. And it's like, I don't know, where did that come from? And then they decided, well, I want to transform into a dragon. It doesn't say you can't do that. It says, okay, this is what happens. And then down at the bottom, eat the moon. It allowed you to get as stupid, crazy as you want kind of thing or whatever. And it says, okay, let's take the story in that direction. As far as narrative structure, kind of yes, kind of no. I think it could be a little bit better structured. To me, it's a little too freeform, but it's just the start. They're just taking advantage of the fact that machine learning and AI is getting to the point where it can add just as much creativity because it's got huge data bank of data that it can pull from to find something similar to what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Player created content. I don't know. If it's responding to everything you say, you're kind of driving the bus on this one.
It's supposedly based on the inputs that previous players have put into it.
But I do know that the second one, it has different genres you can play in. So you can play a hard-boiled detective, you can play fantasy, you can think there's a space-based one, and I can't remember what the other one was.
Post-apocalyptic. Yeah.
Randomness is inspiration. That's about as random as you get. It's taking thoughts off of everyone else's head of other things that they've put up. And then shareable outcomes. And again, maybe the story goes in a way you don't want to discuss or you don't want to share with somebody else. And let's hope it's not taking effect of what's in your browser content.
Yeah, but it does provide a print feature that you can copy and paste the stories that are generated.
So like I said, so I think what comes next, I think something like this, but maybe in a different direction. I would really love to see fiction writing get to the point where it's taking advantage of some of these tools. And I feel less like I have to crank out 10,000 words in order to get through this next chapter, and I could be more of a director. I can say, you know what? I know what my character's like. You know, I know where I want to kind of have the scene go. How about having the computer fill in the rest of the part of the details? Maybe it gives me new ideas, gives me new inspirations on where I can take the next scene, the next chapter. There's places where you can go where you can put your writing online, like in Wattpad, and do it in small chapter bits, and people can give you feedback and commentary on what they like and what they don't like so that you can write the next segment. Why not be able to marry up this with that something? So now you're talking about people who are working collaboratively to tell these larger than world stories, and they're able to emphasize the characters that they want and the directions that they want. Why do I have to wait for an author to write the next volume of a series that I like? Why can't I work with the machine to help mimic that kind of style and take a story in the direction I want? We've got the tools. It's just a matter of somebody stepping forward next and giving us that glimpse of where it is on the next point. And that's kind of where we ran full circle. We started off discussing stories, how games get us there, and now we're talking about how do we get the games to give us better stories. Any questions? Yes?
Curious what you guys think about tabletop games that kind of not eliminate the GM, but sort of model the role of the GM versus players. So, for example, there's I think relatively newer tabletop game called Fellowship, if you're familiar at all with it, where there's a GM who creates a overlord, a evil character in the fantasy world, who then has that GM also has a level of blend over the story and campaign. There's also player characters who are all playing characters in different fantasy roles in whatever fantasy race, elf, or whatever they pick. They get to determine all the lore for their species, their fantasy race within the game. And I was curious what you guys think of, I guess that story machine where GM still exists, but doesn't have complete say over the world building of the setting. In a little more of a, I guess a little more of a regimented fashion.
In my experience, and you can speak to your experience on it, it comes down to trust. If I don't have a GM that I trust or a DM that I trusted, I didn't play with them that often. If I'm talking about a group of 10 of my friends that I'm playing, and I kind of know all their playing experiences at, then I'm okay sharing some of that with them. I don't have to have that one overlord in charge of where the next part of the conversation's going. If I don't know these people, and I don't think that we're all aligned in the same direction, I sure as shit do not want to be sharing where they're going with it. And I apologize for the language for those who are watching at home. Okay. But I mean, I do like the fact that people are exploring an idea and changing what the concept is about what it takes to tell a story. The fact that I don't have to rely on an author, which is really what the DM has been doing for all the role-playing games. They're the author. They got to make up everything else. I like the fact that it's being shared and that they're trusting the players to not abuse that power and make themselves demi-lords.
Yeah. And like one of the systems from the narrative game section that we didn't mention was Polaris, which is interesting. It's designed for 4 players, but it has shared GMing. So like every scene is based on one character, and then the other 3 players around you play different types of characters that are related to your character. Like they're related by family, or the person across from you is the one who's the antagonist. And so it's just kind of interesting that play jumps around between the different players, and everybody plays different characters relating to that main character in that scene.
I do know it also depends heavily on the comfort level of the other people that you're playing for actually speaking and contributing. If you got somebody who's really introvert and they just like being part of the party, but you're never going to see them driving the bus or taking the lead or the charge on something like that there. And they most certainly, you don't want to put them in that uncomfortable position where everybody's turned to face them and say, what's next? I think that, again, that comes down to that part of the trust feel. And like I said, the biggest challenge I've seen with tabletop role-playing game is time. I know when I was younger and it was a lot easier for me to stay up all night and do this all weekend kind of thing with only minor grumbling from my spouse. I don't have time to do that anymore. And to have 6 or 8 people that are going to be able to share that journey with you for 6 months, that to me, I think, is where part of the challenge is. And being able to have a computer, be able to take over some of that role and some of that aspect, and to give you that nudge of inspiration, yet give you the freedom to take the story in the direction that's of interest to you. Like I said, I just hope somebody out there is listening to the point where we can get them to take it in that new direction. Any other questions? Anything that we missed that you guys think that we glossed over that we want to talk further about? We can probably take it offline since they're probably going to be kicking us out here shortly.